My parents demanded to look after the baby as we had a dinner planned at our friend's house. When we returned, we asked for the baby, and my parents said, "We gave it to your sister to look after." When I confronted them and said, "Why didn't you guys ask me at least? You know what kind of woman she is," my mother then slapped me and said, "How dare you speak about her like that?" Then I went to confront my sister and she snorted, "Oh, your baby was making too much noise and disturbing me, so I put it in a bag and left it somewhere." I called 911, and when the police called me that they found the baby and my husband looked at her condition, he made everyone's lives a living hell. Okay, so after 4 years, I'm finally ready to share what happened to my family and how my husband Scott systematically destroyed the lives of everyone who hurt our daughter Piper. Some people say we went too far. Others say we didn't go far enough. You can decide for yourself. It started on what should have been a simple Saturday evening in October 2021. Scott and I had been invited to our friends Todd and Gina's house for dinner. Piper was only 4 months old at the time, and we'd been cooped up at home for weeks. This was going to be our first real night out since she was born, and we were looking forward to some adult conversation and a home-cooked meal that didn't involve reheating leftovers while bouncing a crying baby. My parents, Robert and Linda, had been pestering us for weeks about spending more time with their granddaughter. Every phone call ended with my mother complaining about how they barely saw Piper, how they were getting older and wanted to make memories. So when they offered to babysit that Saturday night, it seemed like the perfect solution. Scott was hesitant. He never particularly liked my family's dynamics, but I convinced him it would be fine. They were my parents, after all. What could go wrong? My sister Jessica had been living with my parents for the past 6 months after her latest relationship imploded. She was 28, 5 years younger than me, and had a long history of making terrible decisions. Drugs, theft, lying, Jessica had done it all. She'd been in and out of rehab 3 times, had stolen money from our parents more times than I could count, and had a restraining order filed against her by her ex-boyfriend after she'd keyed his car and threatened his new girlfriend. But my parents, especially my mother, refused to see Jessica for what she really was. Linda had this twisted view that Jessica was just misunderstood and going through a rough patch. She'd make excuses for every horrible thing Jessica did, always finding ways to blame everyone else for her daughter's behavior. Jessica was the baby of the family, and in my mother's eyes, she could do no wrong. When we dropped Piper off that evening, Jessica was sprawled on the living room couch, smoking cigarettes and watching reality TV with the volume cranked up. She barely looked up when we walked in with the baby carrier, diaper bag, and detailed instructions I'd written out for my parents. "She needs to eat every 2 hours," I explained to my mother, holding up the bottles I'd prepared. "Her formula is in the kitchen, and these are already measured out. Just warm them in the bottle warmer, never the microwave. She usually goes down for a nap around 7:30, and she likes to be swaddled tight." My mother waved me off impatiently. "Sweetheart, I raised 2 children of my own. I think I can handle 1 baby for a few hours." Jessica snorted from the couch. "Yeah, quit being such a control freak, Brenda. It's just a baby. How hard can it be?" Scott stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Her name is Piper, not it. And Brenda isn't being controlling, she's being a responsible mother." Jessica finally turned around, giving Scott a look that could have curdled milk. "Whatever. Just leave the kid and go have your fancy dinner party." I felt the knot forming in my stomach, but my father was already taking the baby carrier from my hands, cooing at Piper with genuine affection. "We'll be fine, Princess," he said, using his old nickname for me. "You two go enjoy yourselves. Piper will be perfectly safe with us." Against my better judgment, we left. Todd and Gina's dinner was exactly what we'd needed. Good food, adult conversation, and 4 blissful hours without thinking about feeding schedules or diaper changes. We talked about work, travel plans for when Piper was older, and felt like ourselves again instead of just mom and dad. For a few hours, I forgot about the gnawing anxiety I'd felt leaving Piper at my parents' house. We got back to my parents' place around 10:30. The house was quieter than usual, the TV was off, and most of the lights were dimmed. I expected to find my parents in the living room, maybe watching the late news with Piper sleeping in her carrier nearby. Instead, I found my mother and father sitting at the kitchen table, looking oddly uncomfortable. "How was dinner?" my mother asked, not quite meeting my eyes. "It was great," I replied, looking around. "Where's Piper?" My parents exchanged a glance that made my blood run cold. "Well," my father cleared his throat, "Jessica was getting a bit overwhelmed, so we gave the baby to her to look after in her room." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "You what?" "Jessica wanted to help. my mother said defensively. She said she was good with babies and wanted to bond with her niece. Scott was already heading toward the stairs. Where is she? Where's Piper? In Jessica's room, my father said. But you might want to knock first. She's probably sleeping. I was right behind Scott as we rushed upstairs. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Jessica's room was at the end of the hall, and I could see light coming from under her door. Scott knocked firmly. Jessica, we're back. We need Piper. There was shuffling from inside, then Jessica's voice, sounding strangely off. Just a minute. More shuffling, then the door opened. Jessica stood there in rumpled clothes, her hair messy, pupils dilated. She was clearly high on something. Where's my daughter? I demanded, pushing past her into the room. The room was a disaster, clothes everywhere, empty beer bottles, cigarette butts overflowing from ashtrays. The window was wide open, and cold October air was streaming in. But no Piper. No baby carrier. No diaper bag. Jessica. Scott's voice was deadly calm. Where is Piper? Jessica shrugged, swaying slightly on her feet. She was crying too much. Giving me a headache. So I dealt with it. What do you mean, you dealt with it? I was screaming now, not caring who heard me. Relax, Brenda. God, you're so dramatic. Jessica collapsed onto her unmade bed. She was making too much noise and disturbing me, so I put her in a bag and left her somewhere safe. She's fine. The world stopped spinning. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Scott grabbed Jessica by the shoulders and shook her. Where? He roared. Where did you put her? Jessica laughed, actually laughed. I don't know. Somewhere outside. She was crying so much, I just wanted some quiet. I was already running downstairs, Scott closed behind me. My parents were standing in the kitchen doorway, looking confused by the commotion. What's going on? My mother asked. Jessica put Piper outside somewhere. I managed to get out between gasps. She said she put her in a bag and left her somewhere. My mother's face went white. That's impossible. Jessica wouldn't do that. Ask her yourself, Scott shouted, pulling out his phone to call 911. Instead of going upstairs to confront Jessica, my mother turned on me. Her face twisted with rage, and before I could react, she slapped me hard across the face. How dare you speak about her like that? She screamed. Jessica would never hurt a baby. You're just trying to make her look bad because you've always been jealous of her. I stood there, my cheek burning, staring at my mother in complete shock. My 4-month-old daughter was missing, possibly dead, and she was defending Jessica. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice came through Scott's phone speaker. My 4-month-old daughter is missing, Scott said, his voice shaking. My sister-in-law says she put her in a bag and left her outside somewhere. We need police and search teams immediately. As Scott gave our location and details to the dispatcher, I turned back to my parents. My father was standing there like a statue, his face gray with shock. My mother was still glaring at me with fury. You're going to destroy this family, she hissed. Jessica made a mistake, but calling the police? That's going too far. A mistake? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She put my baby in a bag and abandoned her outside in 40-degree weather. That's not a mistake, that's attempted murder. The next few hours were the longest of my life. Police arrived within minutes, followed by search and rescue teams. They questioned Jessica, who by then was coming down from whatever high she'd been on and was starting to realize the magnitude of what she'd done. She kept changing her story. First she said she'd left Piper by the back door, then by the garbage cans, then maybe somewhere in the neighborhood. Scott was like a man possessed, leading search teams through the neighborhood, checking every dumpster, every alley, every possible place a drugged-out woman might abandon a baby. I stayed by the phone, calling Piper's pediatrician to make sure medical teams would be ready when we found her. Because we were going to find her. The alternative was unthinkable. At 3:47 a.m., Officer Reynolds called with the news that saved my sanity. We found her, he said. She's alive. Hypothermic and dehydrated, but alive. We're taking her to Children's Hospital. Piper had been found in a plastic shopping bag behind a gas station 6 blocks from my parents' house. She'd been outside in 38-degree temperatures for over 5 hours. The plastic bag had actually provided some insulation from the wind, and Piper's thick winter outfit had helped retain some body heat, but when Scott saw her in the emergency room, blue-tinged and barely responsive, something in him broke. But something else was born in that moment, a cold, calculating fury that would consume the next 3 years of our lives. Piper spent 4 days in the hospital. She had hypothermia, severe dehydration, and what doctors called failure to thrive from the trauma. But she was alive, and she was going to be okay. Scott barely left her side, sleeping in the hospital chair, holding her tiny hand and whispering promises that he was going to make everyone pay for what they'd done to her. While Piper recovered, the legal system swung into action. Jessica was arrested and charged with child endangerment, reckless endangerment, and child abuse. My parents were investigated for negligence and failure to supervise. The whole thing made the local news. Baby found abandoned behind gas station after family dispute. But Scott wasn't satisfied with criminal charges. While I focused on Piper's recovery, he started planning something much more comprehensive. Scott worked in corporate finance for a large investment firm, and through his work he built relationships with private investigators, attorneys, and had access to financial resources that most people don't. His company handled mergers and acquisitions, which meant he understood how to research companies, trace financial connections, and identify vulnerabilities in business operations. These skills, combined with his network of professional contacts and his willingness to spend our savings on this campaign, made possible what might seem impossible for an ordinary person. He was methodical, patient, and absolutely ruthless when he needed to be. Over the next several months, while outwardly being the perfect husband and father, he quietly began dismantling the lives of everyone who had hurt our daughter. He started with Jessica. Her court case was straightforward. With her history of drug abuse and multiple witnesses to her confession, she was looking at serious prison time. But Scott wasn't content to let the justice system run its course. He hired a private investigator to dig into every aspect of Jessica's life, documenting every crime she'd ever committed, every person she'd hurt, every bridge she'd burned. The investigator found evidence that Jessica had been dealing drugs out of my parents' house, using their address to receive packages of stolen goods she bought online, and had been collecting unemployment benefits while working under-the-table jobs. Scott compiled all of this evidence and anonymously sent it to the relevant authorities. By the time Jessica's trial began, she was facing not just the charges related to Piper, but also federal charges for mail fraud, drug distribution, and benefit fraud. What should have been a 2-year sentence turned into 8 years in federal prison. But Scott was just getting started. My mother, Linda, worked as a school administrator in the local district. She'd been there for 15 years and was proud of her position as assistant principal at the elementary school. Scott discovered that Linda had been using her position to give Jessica information about families in the district, which houses would be empty during school events, which families had expensive items worth stealing, which single mothers might be vulnerable to Jessica's various scams. Scott spent months collecting evidence, interviewing Jessica's victims, and building an airtight case. Then he presented everything to the district's Internal Affairs Department and the State Education Board. Linda was fired immediately and lost her teaching license permanently. At age 58, her career was over. But Scott wasn't done with Linda. He also discovered that she'd been claiming Jessica as a dependent on her taxes for years, even when Jessica was living independently and working. Scott reported this to the IRS, leading to a full audit of my parents' finances going back 7 years. They ended up owing over $40,000 in back taxes and penalties. My father, Robert, was a middle manager at a local manufacturing company. He was close to retirement and looking forward to a comfortable pension. Scott found out that Robert had been helping Jessica by letting her use the company's address for various schemes and had occasionally let her into the building after hours to use their computers and internet for activities that weren't exactly legal. Scott presented evidence of this to Robert's employers. While Robert hadn't directly participated in any criminal activity, he'd violated company policy by allowing unauthorized access to the building. He was fired 6 months before he was eligible for his full pension, losing over $100,000 in retirement benefits. Scott also made sure that every person in my parents' social circle knew exactly what had happened that night. He attended every community meeting, every church service, every neighborhood gathering where my parents were present. He didn't make dramatic scenes or accusations, he simply told the truth. He carried photos of Piper in the hospital and calmly explained what Jessica had done and how my parents had enabled it. My parents went from being respected members of their community to pariahs. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors avoided them. They were asked to step down from their volunteer positions at the church. Their social world, which they'd spent decades building, crumbled completely. But the masterpiece of Scott's revenge was what he did to their house. My parents had bought their house in 1987, and had been paying the mortgage faithfully for over 30 years. They were just 3 years away from paying it off completely when everything fell apart. Scott discovered that they'd refinanced multiple times over the years to bail Jessica out of various financial troubles, sometimes taking cash out for her legal fees, sometimes to pay off debts she'd run up in their names. What had started as a manageable 15-year mortgage in 1987 had been refinanced into a 30-year loan in 2019, meaning their current balance was actually higher than their original loan amount despite decades of payments. Scott also found out that my father had used the house as collateral for several loans over the years, money that had all gone to supporting Jessica's lifestyle and legal problems. With Robert's job loss and Linda's firing, they were suddenly unable to make their mortgage payments. Scott waited until they were exactly 90 days behind on their payments, then approached the bank that held their mortgage. Banks are often eager to sell problem loans to avoid foreclosure costs, and Scott's firm had relationships with several lending institutions. Through a complicated arrangement involving his company's investment fund, Scott was able to purchase the distressed mortgage at a discount. As the new mortgage holder, he immediately began foreclosure proceedings. My parents tried desperately to catch up on their payments, but Scott made sure they couldn't. Every job Robert applied for, Scott's network of contacts ensured he didn't get it. Every attempt Linda made to find work in education was blocked by her permanent loss of credentials and Scott's quiet words to the right people. When the foreclosure went through, Scott bought the house at auction for a fraction of its value. My parents, who'd lived there for over 30 years, found themselves homeless and bankrupt. Scott didn't stop there. He rented the house back to a lovely young family with 2 small children, the Johnsons. He gave them a below-target rent and told them the full story of what had happened. When my parents drove by their old house and saw children playing in what used to be their yard, the psychological impact was devastating. During Piper's recovery, I started to see a side of Scott I'd never witnessed before. He became obsessed with documentation, spending hours every night researching legal precedents, taking notes, making phone calls to lawyers and private investigators. He created elaborate spreadsheets tracking every person who had played a role in what happened to Piper, every connection they had, every vulnerability he could exploit. "You don't understand," he told me one night when I suggested maybe we should focus on healing instead of revenge. "They didn't just hurt Piper. They broke something fundamental about trust and family. Your mother looked you in the eye while our daughter was missing and chose to protect the person who tried to kill her. That's not something you forgive and move on from." He was right, but watching him work was frightening sometimes. Scott had always been methodical in his approach to problems, but this was different. This was personal in a way that consumed him completely. The first phase of his plan focused on Jessica, but not in the obvious ways. While she sat in county jail awaiting trial, Scott was systematically dismantling her entire support network. He reached out to every landlord she'd ever stiffed, every employer she'd stolen from, every friend she'd betrayed. He collected statements, evidence, documentation of patterns of behavior that went back years. Jessica had always survived by manipulating people, playing the victim, finding new enablers when she'd burned out the old ones. Scott made sure that every person she might turn to knew exactly what she was capable of. He created what he called the Truth Campaign, not spreading lies or gossip, but making sure the full truth about Jessica's history was available to anyone who might be tempted to help her. By the time Jessica's trial began 6 months later, she had no one left. No character witnesses, no family members willing to speak on her behalf. My parents had been advised by their lawyers to distance themselves, no friends who hadn't been warned about her history. She sat alone at the defendant's table with only her overworked public defender for support. But Scott's masterpiece during this period was what he did with social media and the internet. Jessica had always been active online, bragging about her lifestyle, posting photos of expensive items she couldn't afford, building a facade of success and happiness. Scott hired a tech expert to archive every post, every photo, every comment Jessica had ever made online. Then he created what looked like fan sites for Jessica, websites that claimed to admire her authentic lifestyle and brave choices. These sites collected every incriminating thing she'd ever posted, every photo of her with drugs, every boast about scamming someone, every cruel comment about family members. The sites were designed to look supportive while actually documenting years of criminal behavior and moral bankruptcy. The genius was that these sites came up first in any internet search of Jessica's name. Any potential employer, landlord, or romantic partner who Googled her would immediately find a comprehensive record of her worst moments, presented as if they were something to be proud of. Scott had effectively made Jessica unemployable and unrentable for life, all while maintaining plausible deniability. He was just celebrating her authentic self. Meanwhile, the investigation into my parents' role was expanding beyond what any of us had expected. It turned out that Jessica's drug dealing operation had been much more extensive than anyone realized. She'd been using my parents' address not just for receiving stolen goods, but as a hub for a network of dealers and users throughout the county. The police found evidence that Jessica had been storing drugs in my parents' garage, using their internet to coordinate sales, and hosting parties where drugs were used and sold. My parents claimed they had no knowledge of any of this, but Scott's investigation revealed otherwise. He'd interviewed neighbors who remembered strange cars coming and going from my parents' house at all hours. He'd found financial records showing that my parents had been paying for Jessica's cell phone plan, the same phone she'd been using to coordinate drug sales. Most damning, he'd found security camera footage from a nearby business that showed Jessica and known drug dealers moving boxes from my parents' garage to various cars over the course of several months. Scott presented all of this to the district attorney, not as Jessica's brother-in-law seeking revenge, but as a concerned citizen who happened to have access to information that might be relevant to the case. The DA was impressed by the thoroughness of the investigation and decided to pursue additional charges against Jessica for operating a drug distribution network. More importantly for Scott's larger plan, the evidence strongly suggested that my parents had to have known what was happening on their property. Even if they couldn't be charged criminally, the civil liability was enormous. Scott quietly funded several lawsuits from people who had been harmed by drugs traced back to Jessica's operation at my parents' house. The lawsuits were perfectly legal and well documented. A teenager who had overdosed on fentanyl bought from Jessica sued my parents for providing the location where the drugs were stored and sold. A family whose house had been burglarized by one of Jessica's addict friends sued for creating the criminal network that targeted their neighborhood. Each lawsuit was small individually, but Scott made sure there were dozens of them. My parents' homeowners insurance initially tried to fight the claims, but Scott had made sure the evidence of their knowledge and participation was overwhelming. The insurance company eventually settled most of the cases, but then dropped my parents' coverage entirely. Suddenly, they were facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal judgments with no insurance protection and no way to get new coverage. This was when Scott's financial background became crucial. He understood exactly how to push someone into bankruptcy without it being traceable back to him. He knew which creditors to contact, which assets to target, how to time everything for maximum impact. The psychological warfare was just as devastating as the financial attacks. Scott had studied my parents carefully over the years of our marriage, and he knew exactly what mattered most to them. My father prided himself on being a pillar of the community. He'd served on the city council, volunteered with local charities, was known as someone you could count on. My mother valued her reputation as a devoted grandmother and family woman. Scott systematically destroyed both of those identities. He attended every city council meeting where my father was present, always sitting in the front row where Robert could see him. He never said a word or caused a disruption, but his presence was a constant reminder of what Robert had allowed to happen to his granddaughter. Other council members began asking uncomfortable questions about Robert's judgment and whether someone who couldn't protect a baby in his own home should be making decisions for the community. Scott also made sure that every local charity my father volunteered with received detailed information about the drug operation that had been running out of his house. Even though Robert wasn't charged criminally, the liability risk was too high for nonprofit organizations. One by one, they politely asked him to step down from his volunteer positions. For my mother, Scott's approach was more subtle but equally effective. Linda had always been proud of her role as the family matriarch, the one who held everyone together and made sure family gatherings happened. Scott made sure those gatherings became impossible. He reached out to every extended family member, aunts, uncles, cousins, and provided them with complete documentation of what had happened that night. Not angry accusations or demands that they choose sides, just the facts, what Jessica had done, how my parents had reacted, what the consequences had been for Piper. The response was immediate and devastating for my mother. Family members who had looked up to Linda as the responsible one, the one who always did the right thing, were horrified by what they learned. Invitations to family events stopped coming. Holiday gatherings were relocated to other relatives' homes without explanation. Phone calls went unreturned. Linda tried desperately to rebuild these relationships, but Scott had been thorough in his documentation. Every family member had copies of the police reports, hospital records, and transcripts from Jessica's confession. They'd seen the photos of Piper in the hospital. They knew that Linda had slapped me while my baby was missing and had defended Jessica even after learning what she'd done. The family Scott had grown up observing from the outside, with its complex dynamics and unspoken rules, crumbled completely under the weight of the truth about who these people really were when tested. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of Scott's campaign was how he handled the community response. Our town wasn't large, and news of what had happened to Piper spread quickly. Scott made sure it spread accurately and completely. He spoke at community meetings about child safety, always telling Piper's story as an example of how quickly things could go wrong when adults failed in their responsibilities. He didn't have to mention my parents by name, everyone knew who he was talking about. He joined the PTA at the elementary school where my mother had worked, advocating for stronger background check policies for anyone who worked around children. The message was clear: these people had been trusted with the most precious thing in the world, and they had failed catastrophically. Could the community trust them with anything else? The answer, consistently, was no. Scott's investigation also revealed something that added another layer to his revenge plan. Jessica had been stealing from my parents for far longer and in far more extensive ways than anyone had realized. She'd been forging my father's signature on checks, using my mother's credit cards for online purchases, even taking out loans in my parents' names. Scott compiled all of this evidence and presented it to my parents' insurance companies, banks, and creditors. Suddenly, my parents weren't just victims of their daughter's drug dealing, they were potentially complicit in financial fraud that had been going on for years. The banks demanded immediate repayment of fraudulent loans. Credit card companies canceled their accounts and demanded full balances. Insurance companies launched investigations into whether my parents had been aware of Jessica's activities when they filed previous claims. My parents found themselves in a web of financial obligations they couldn't meet, with their credit destroyed and no way to borrow money to solve their problems. Every attempt to refinance their mortgage or consolidate their debt was rejected because of the cloud of fraud investigations surrounding their finances. Scott had effectively made it impossible for my parents to maintain their lifestyle or dig themselves out of the hole Jessica had created for them. And because all of the evidence came from legitimate investigations into Jessica's crimes, there was no way to trace any of it back to Scott's orchestration. The criminal justice system had its own timeline. Jessica's trial was a media circus, with Scott making sure local news covered every detail of what she'd done to Piper. He provided them with hospital photos, medical records, and his own victim impact statement that left the courtroom in tears. Jessica was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, but even that wasn't the end of her punishment. Scott made sure she was placed in a facility where several inmates were mothers whose own children had been taken away. He didn't directly cause what happened to Jessica in prison, but he certainly didn't feel sorry when she spent most of her sentence in protective custody after multiple incidents with other inmates. 2 years after that horrible night, my parents were living in a one-bedroom apartment across town, both working minimum-wage jobs, and facing years of financial ruin. They'd lost their house, their careers, their social standing, and their retirement savings. They were in their late 50s, starting over with nothing. My mother tried to reach out to me several times, wanting to work things out and move past this unpleasantness. She never once apologized for slapping me or for defending Jessica. She never acknowledged that their negligence had nearly cost Piper her life. Instead, she blamed Scott for overreacting and destroying the family over one mistake. I didn't respond to her calls or letters. There was nothing left to say. Scott's revenge was methodical, legal, and absolutely devastating. He never broke a single law or engaged in anything that could be traced back to him directly. He simply used his resources, connections, and knowledge to ensure that everyone who had hurt our daughter faced appropriate consequences for their actions. Some people have asked me if I think Scott went too far. If maybe we should have just let the criminal justice system handle things and tried to forgive and move on. To those people, I show them the photos from that night in the hospital. Piper, barely 4 months old, blue with cold, connected to machines that were keeping her alive. I tell them about the months of therapy she needed, the night terrors that lasted until she was 3 years old, the way she still sometimes flinches when she hears sudden loud noises. Then I ask them, what would you have done? Jessica got 8 years in prison for what she did to Piper. My parents lost their house, their careers, and their social standing for enabling her and failing to protect their granddaughter. Scott made sure that everyone who contributed to Piper's suffering faced real consequences for their actions. Was it revenge? Absolutely. Was it justice? I think so. Piper is 4 years old now, a bright, happy child who loves gymnastics and reading. She has no memory of that terrible night, and we've made sure she grows up knowing she's loved and protected. She knows she has grandparents and an aunt, but she also knows they made choices that hurt her when she was little, and that's why they're not part of our lives. Scott and I are still married, stronger than ever after going through something that destroys many couples. We have one more child now, a son named Felix who is 18 months old. We live in a different state, far from my parents and all the memories of that time. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my mother had reacted differently that night. If she'd immediately called the police instead of slapping me and defending Jessica. If she'd shown remorse for what happened instead of trying to minimize it. Would Scott still have destroyed their lives so thoroughly? I don't think so. Scott's anger wasn't just about what Jessica did, it was about my parents' complete failure to take responsibility for their role in nearly killing our daughter. It was about my mother slapping me while our baby was missing, possibly dead. It was about their continued efforts to protect and enable Jessica even after seeing what she was capable of. They had chances to make things right. They chose not to take them. As for Jessica, she was released from prison 8 months ago after serving 5.5 years of her sentence. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she's living in a halfway house in another state, working at a fast food restaurant, and struggling with the reality that her criminal record makes it nearly impossible to find decent employment or housing. She's also been ordered to pay restitution for Piper's medical bills and ongoing therapy, which she'll probably be paying for the rest of her life. Scott made sure of that too. People ask me if I feel guilty about what happened to my family. The answer is no, I don't. They made their choices, and Scott made sure they faced the consequences. Piper deserved justice, and she got it. Some nights, when I'm putting Piper to bed and she asks me about her grandparents, I feel a moment of sadness for what could have been. In another world, maybe my parents would have been the kind of grandparents who would have protected Piper instead of endangering her. Maybe Jessica would have gotten the help she needed before she became the kind of person who could abandon a baby in a bag behind a gas station. But that's not the world we live in. In our world, my husband made sure that everyone who hurt our daughter paid a price that matched the magnitude of their betrayal. And I sleep better at night knowing that. The last time I saw my parents was at Jessica's sentencing hearing 4 years ago. They looked older, worn down by everything that had happened to them. My mother tried to approach me in the courthouse hallway, but Scott stepped between us. "You had your chance," he told her quietly. "You chose to protect the person who tried to kill our daughter instead of taking responsibility for what happened under your roof. There are consequences for choices like that." My father just stood there, looking defeated. He never tried to contact us after that day. I don't regret what Scott did. I don't regret cutting my family out of our lives. I don't regret any of it. Because every night, I get to kiss Piper goodnight and know that she's safe, loved, and protected by parents who would move heaven and earth to keep her from harm. And everyone who failed her that night learned exactly what that looks like. The story could end there, but there's one more thing I want to share. Last month, Piper came home from school and told us about a presentation her class had done on family trees. She'd drawn our little family, Scott and me, her 2 little brothers, our dog Max, and when her teacher asked about grandparents, Piper said she didn't have any. "Some kids don't have grandparents because they died," she explained to us that evening. "But mine just made bad choices." Scott and I looked at each other over her head, and I saw something I hadn't seen in his eyes for a long time: peace. Piper understands, in the way children do, that people who make bad choices have consequences. She knows she's loved and protected, and that's what matters. That night, after the kids were in bed, Scott and I sat on our back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset. Our son Felix was sleeping peacefully in his crib upstairs, and Piper was tucked safely in her bed after her bedtime story. "Do you ever wonder how things would be different if we'd just let the courts handle everything?" I asked him. Scott was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think about Piper in that hospital room every day. I think about how cold she was, how still. I think about your mother slapping you while our baby was missing. And I know I'd do it all again, exactly the same way." He reached over and took my hand. They didn't just hurt Piper that night. They broke something in our family that can never be fixed. But maybe that's okay. Maybe some things aren't supposed to be forgiven. I squeezed his hand back, thinking about the family we built from the ashes of that terrible night. Different from what I'd grown up thinking family should look like, but stronger and more honest than anything I'd known before. Piper is safe. Our boys are safe. We're all safe. And everyone who threatened that safety learned that Scott and I don't make idle promises when it comes to protecting our children. That's the story. That's what happened when my parents demanded to look after the baby, and why my husband made everyone's lives a living hell. Some people might call it excessive. Others might call it justice. I call it love.